So we're going to be talking about circuit riders. And this is actually a huge part of our history, and it's also a major part of American religious history. So now, as I've said a couple times, Methodist history is really American history, right? Because the Methodist Church was so integral and so important in just the layout of our country and just how it continued to grow, how we related to one another, how we were connected to one another. And part of that is because the church has been a huge part of our country's history. So, and Methodist being one of the biggest denominations throughout the growth of our country, our history as Methodists really is a history lesson in our country. So, as I said last session, Francis Asbury was a really great administrator, and he was really great at organizing everybody. So after the American Revolution, as I said, it really left a vacuum because all of the Church of England priests that were here in America, they pledged their loyalty to the king, so they couldn't, stay. A lot of them left, and Francis Asbury is one of the only people that stayed. And the real culture of the churches in America after we become a country, the culture is a real mistrust and kind of like a kind of distancing themselves from any church that's controlled by the state. And the ethos is this kind of egalitarian, democratic way of viewing church life. So instead of, in the Church of England, they really saw themselves as part of the workings of the monarchy, right? The Church of England pledges loyalty to the king, and they believe that their monarch is anointed by God and whatnot. That really changes in America. That doesn't really translate in America. And the Methodist Church really filled that vacuum because the Methodist atmosphere was this idea that, God created all of us equal. In the Methodist movement, especially in Britain, as I said, it's spanned all different classes. So you had very highly educated people like John Wesley, educated in Oxford, but you had very poor people, and you had people working in the lower rungs of society that were in the lower rungs of society, and they were welcomed just as well as anyone else. So that idea of, and also that idea of holiness of heart and life, to be passionate about your faith, to really take ownership of your growth in faith, really resonated with the churches or the Christians in America, and they really responded to the Methodist movement. So Asbury, he really created this circuit, and itinerancy is a British Methodist idea where Wesley saw that, if a preacher just goes to the same place, the same area, then he gets bored and he becomes stagnant and complacent. So he created an itinerant, like a circle, right? So they travel around in a circuit, and then they're able to share ideas and resources and find out what's happening in all the other different churches. And one one preacher can reach a whole lot of people through one circuit. So this translates in a very crucial way when the Methodist Church starts in America, because not only are you talking, in Britain, if you do a circuit, you could span a whole bunch of towns and meet a whole bunch of people, preach a whole bunch of different sermons in one day. But in America, as we are sending circuit riders all the way through the frontier, right, the wild, wild west, you could be on horseback for miles and miles and miles and not see a town. But if you think about it, the only way that these people in these remote towns that are starting to grow all around the country, the only way that they're going to get a pastor is through a system like a circuit. So this really becomes crucial in the expansion of the Methodist Church in our early start of American Methodism. So they were also circuit riders. They were also very unique. The book, The Beginning of the Methodist Church in the US, Owens, he describes circuit riders as being very rugged. They were very young, and they were kind of like a youth crusade. And they were, not scared of the wilderness. They were not scared of what was out there, maybe because they were young, but they started off, a lot of them pretty uneducated. They kind of had this muscular Christianity ethos to them. So this rough and tumble group of young, men that become ordained as preachers, they get set on a circuit, and in some sense, you have to be fearless, right? You have to be really brave and kind of rugged, rough around the edges. And a lot of them didn't have formal education. So you kind of had to be that way. But so let me move so not to block this picture. But what Owens states is that in his book is that over time, this rough and tumble group of circuit riders, they actually become educated because they are on a strict schedule. And one really educated person went to Asbury and said, how could you allow this ragtag group of people to be preachers? And he replied, he says, we tell one another all we know and then use it at once. A penny used is better than an idle dollar. You study books. We study men, the Bible, the hymn book, Mr. Wesley's sermons, and are instant, meaning relevant, in season and out of season. So this idea of real immediacy for everything. So they have this group of preachers. They work together. They learn from one another. They discuss. As the quote says, they have, with every circuit rider, they have the hymnal, a book of John Wesley's sermons, they have the Bible, and they learn from that. And over time, they have other literature as well. But it's this idea of, we're gonna have these things, and then we take all of our experiences, everything that we've all learned collectively, we are going to work together and learn from each other. And this idea was, even though they are quote unquote uneducated, they end up becoming very, very educated, and they end up becoming very effective in everything that they do. So one of the things that they are required to do as part of their training is they have to study 5 hours a day. They end up becoming very educated. And they also have a lot of literature. They're always studying, reading, this idea of, as they're on the road, wherever they stop, they're studying and reading, and then they're preaching time and time again. So they are learning, and they end up becoming, over time, cultivated, educated, and very effective preachers. And as the circuit riders continue to expand, the folklore is that nobody was out except crows and Methodist preachers. So this is an actual line, so if the weather was really bad, they're like, no, you're not going to find anybody but crows and the circuit riders, right? Because it didn't matter if it was raining, it didn't matter if it was snowing, it didn't matter, what the elements were. It didn't matter if you had the Appalachians in front of you or you had a swamp. It didn't matter, because you had to go, you had to go through your circuit. And they really lived off of the hospitality of others. So Owens, he goes on and he says that they never owned a house. Very few of them were ever married, were able to settle down and have kids. The quote is, they spend a good part of their lives hungry, wet, cold, verminous, and saddle sore. And if they did not die young of consumption, they could expect an old age of rheumatism and dyspepsia, right? So a lot of them were 25 or so. A lot of them didn't live past, actually maybe teenagers. A lot of them didn't live past 35 years of age. And if they were lucky enough to live past that, they oftentimes, the rest of their lives, suffered from serious health issues, because they literally lived their lives on the back of a horse, going from one place to the next. So if you can imagine, always, vulnerable to the elements, if you can imagine the effect that has on your health, that would be really difficult. And they were also really held in connection with one another. One of the things I said was, one of their methods was they would carry literature, and that literature would travel with them everywhere. So they would carry pamphlets and church books, devotion books, whatever new literature is out there, and they would carry them. And that idea was they would sell it as they went from church to church, and they could, earn a little bit off of that selling. But it was a way to really strengthen the connection, really expand, uh, you know, the fervor of, learning the Bible, to see, what people are writing, what people are thinking. And that was a really effective way to connect through the connection. And so the system was adopted in the 1800 General Conference, um, and it really helped, because it really helped the circuit riders earn a little bit. They were never rich or well off, but it helped them get by. So yeah, through this system of circuit riders, they were able to take resources from the cities. So, for example, the Tennessee and Ohio Conference were the center, and the circuit riders were sent west to Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. And they were able to bring resources, they were able to preach, they were able to connect these small rural areas to larger cities. And they would also be able to find out what's happening in the next, town, or what happened to, this person or that person, and prayer requests, and what's happening in the general church. They were able to connect in that way. So Theodore Roosevelt actually is documented in saying this. The whole country is under a debt of gratitude to the Methodist circuit riders, the Methodist pioneer preachers whose movement westward kept pace with the movement of the frontier, who shared all the hardship in the life of a frontiersman while at the same time ministering to the frontiersman needs. So historically, it's known that circuit riders really contributed to the well-being of American life. They really were able to provide guidance, wisdom, obviously spiritual leadership to these remote, isolated areas where, more resources might not want to be there or go out there, but circuit riders were willing to go out there. So historically, it's really thought that the circuit riders contributed a lot. Okay, so we're going to learn about Richard Allen. He was born in 1760, and he was born as a slave. He's just one of the most amazing people, and I think really underrated. We don't hear a lot about Richard Allen. Well, we don't hear enough, I don't think. But he grew up during the American Revolution, and at that time, there was this growing understanding. Denominations like the Methodist denomination were really starting to have a firm identity of who they are and how they were contributing to society. It was the growth, obviously, of the anti-slavery movement that continues to catch momentum. And in 1768, Allen's owner ends up selling him and his family to an owner in Delaware named Stokey Sturgis. And what happens is, I believe it's the same owner. The whole family goes to that owner, but he has different plantations, so the family gets split up. So he gets taken from his family. He's 8 years old. He's a young boy. He gets taken from his family, and I believe different sources say he never sees his family again. But in 1777, he's converted to Methodism, and he attends Methodist meetings, and he's exposed to Methodist preachers. So he becomes a Christian, and he really identifies with the Methodist Church. And then as the Methodist Church is continuing to grow, um, he really resonates with just the movement of advocating for honesty, modesty, sobriety. And these were the themes that were really stressed in the Methodist Church. So as he's starting to grow, he actually as he's starting to grow in his faith, he starts going around and he starts preaching. He's accepted to preach in different Methodist churches. And it wasn't uncommon to have like even a Black slave preaching to a Methodist white church. That sounds very, very surprising, but that was the atmosphere and that would happen. And in 1780, Sturgis agrees to some conditions for his freedom. So he has to purchase his freedom for $2,000, and he has to pay that over the course of 5 years. So he ends up paying his last piece of debt to his owner in 1786, and he becomes a free man. So he continues to he finds work here and there, and then he continues to get invitations to preach, and he's known to be a very gifted, dynamic preacher. And then he accepts an invitation to be on like the preaching rotation at St. George's Church in Philadelphia. St. George's Church is actually one of the oldest churches in America. It's a very historic Methodist church. I think it's the oldest church in American history that's still in use today. Maybe the oldest Protestant church. But yeah, so he's there, and he's there. His time is in the morning, right? So when he preaches in the morning, there was a small population of Black congregants that would come, and his preaching was so dynamic and so powerful that morning, those morning numbers started to increasingly expand, and a lot more people, especially other slaves, other free Black families, communities, they started to come to hear him preach. And that's the start of this tension that happens in St. George's Church. So as they start growing, Richard Allen requests to the elders in St. George's Church, can you build us a separate facility or provide us another place where we can worship? And they decided they weren't going to do that, but they were going to create a balcony where they could be. But that really starts like this segregation where the Black congregants have to sit in the balcony area, and they're not allowed to be in the main area. So they are kind of relegated to the balcony in the back. So this is a picture, it's a beautiful church. And this is the balcony right over here. So they weren't allowed to be down here. And as you can see, they're almost like out of sight. They're all the way up here, very high up. So if you're sitting down here, you're just staring up here at the pulpit. You wouldn't even see them or even notice them. And this really starts to cause, conflict and problems. So he continues to be very committed to the Methodist Church. And in 1792, one of his good friends, Jones, is sitting in the arrangement, that one of the pews downstairs. And in the middle of the prayer time, two white trustees, they're probably, elders or leaders of the church, lay leaders, they come and they force Jones to leave. And Allen is watching this with the other Black congregants, and he decides, if the white parishioners, if they stand up and they say that this is wrong, then we'll stay. If they remain silent, then we're going to leave. And nobody says anything. So all the Black congregants get up and they leave. So while this is happening, they create, so Jones and Richard Allen create a new society called the Free African Society, and they founded the African Church of Philadelphia. And this started because of this rift in St. George's Church. And Richard Allen becomes the first Black priest, and it's the denomination, it's consecrated in the Protestant Episcopal Church. So this is what happens. And then as this is happening, just after that happens, and they're starting to form this society and this congregation, the yellow fever pandemic of Philadelphia, it's literally called the 1793 yellow fever pandemic of Philadelphia, happens. And yellow fever, it's a terrible disease, and it happened as I think French immigrants were coming from the docks, and they were fleeing some unrest there, and it ends up spreading. And what happens is the mayor at the time, Rush, he asks Richard Allen if they could help with this pandemic. So he does, and he enlists. I think I have to go forward. So this is the dock where it's spread, and a lot of people, a lot of the physicians, they actually fled the city. But Benjamin Rush, he asks Richard Allen to help, and he asks the Free African Society to help. And so there are two churches involved. They come together and they end up being caretakers, almost like nurses, through this pandemic. And they go to house. They're treating people with this pandemic. And what Rush promises Allen is, you will, the Black community will be accepted and praised, and it'll be really good. So that, I mean, I'm sure that wasn't his motivation, but that's what he said. Well, the opposite happened, because this pamphlet was published by Matthew Carey, and he documents what happened with the pandemic, and he documents it. But it's funny because he's one of the physicians that left. He didn't stay behind, but he documents it, and he paints the African American community as being, bandits, and going into people's homes and robbing them, and kind of maligning this movement that was really helpful. So Richard Allen, he and his friend Jones, they publish a document counteracting this pamphlet. It's like a 12-page pamphlet, and then Matthew Carey rescinds all of his accusations and says he's right. And it's funny because Matthew Carey actually ended up making a lot of money from this, and he kind of accused Richard Allen and some of the people helping that they're helping to make money, but they actually didn't make any money. So Richard Allen, in his pamphlet, he talks about what he did, how he helped, how he was able to mobilize people, and also a documented account of any funds that were exchanged, meaning he didn't make anything. So but yeah, that happens. And this is a picture. I think this was published in the 1800s. This is yellow fever, right? You go from a regular person to getting worse and worse. So this pandemic, it really explodes. Thousands of people die. And I felt like we could kind of talk about this and highlight this because of kind of what we're going through. But there is this idea where he really lambasts Matthew Carey and all of the physicians that fled, that they just left, and they left the city vulnerable. So yeah, and Richard Allen's words was from the mayor. He directed us to where to procure medicine duly prepared with proper directions, how to administer them, and at what stages of the disorder to bleed the patients. And when we found ourselves incapable of judging what was proper to be done, to apply to him. So this is what Richard Allen is saying that Rush told him to do, as they're going around caring for their patients. And as they were doing this, they helped around 800 people, asking nothing for in return. So yeah, as I said, he publishes this document. You can view this document. I'm going to try to find the link. It's viewable through the Digital Theological Library, but I know you need a membership. I'll try to find a way to send out these two pamphlets, one, with the accusation, and then one combating the accusation. And supposedly what Richard Allen wrote in response, I think, is the first published, copyrighted written document from an African-American person in the US. So again, our history is American history. So even despite all of this, everything that happened, Richard Allen really remains loyal to the Methodist Church. So he continues to collect his savings. He buys a former blacksmith's shop, and he turns it into a plot of land, and he builds a church called the Bethel African Church, and it opens February 4th, 1794. And Allen is ordained as its deacon. So as this is happening, as it gets included in the Methodist connection in 1796, it's officially initiated at the Methodist Conference. A lot of other white Methodist officials want to subsume or to claim ownership of this church, and it continues this long legal battle. And in 1807, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court declares that this church is rightfully owned by the Black Methodist congregation. So as this continues to happen, many Black Methodists form African Methodist churches in northeastern cities. And over time, they congregate together, they meet together, and they create their own church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So this is a picture of now it's called the Mother Bethel African Church in Philadelphia. It's a beautiful church, but this is actually it's also, I think it's the first building owned by African Americans for a religious institution in the United States. So I wrote it, the oldest church property in the United States to be continuously owned by African Americans. And now it's a historic landmark. There's a museum in the church as well. And you see that this is the inside. It's very beautiful, very nice. And there's a plaque, and there is I think, a sarcophagus of Richard Allen's body and his wife's body underneath. So it's really like it's a museum, but it's still an active church. So all the leaders of these churches, like I said, they unite and they create the AME Church, and they gain control of governance of their churches, and they are free from white ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And they have this new denomination, and this denomination continues till this day. And Richard Allen serves as its bishop until he passes away in 1831. So the AME Church becomes the center of Black institutional life. And throughout Black history, is also thought to be one of the first nonviolent civil rights leaders in this way. So he's a part of our history, and he's really a trailblazer, not only in our church, but for our country.